"Mom, Chloe said you'd ruin the wedding photos, so don't come." My son's voice cut colder than winter. The scissors slipped from my hand. To him, I was just an ugly, poor burden. But under my bed lay a secret worth millions. So I chose a wedding gift he would never forget. One that would follow him all the way to my funeral. The line went dead. I just stood there, holding the phone to my ear, listening to the silence. It felt heavier than his words. Slowly, I placed the receiver back in its cradle. A soft click echoed in the little shop that had been my entire world for 30 years. My eyes drifted to the half-finished wedding guest dress on the machine, its delicate lace a cruel reminder of a celebration I was no longer a part of. The irony was a bitter taste in my mouth. I looked up, saw the photo on the shelf, remembered a promise made long ago. For my entire life, every single stitch I made was for Ethan, a thread pulling him toward a future I would never have. Now, he used that very future to cut me out of his life completely. Have you ever watched your own love become a weapon against you? My son's voice was cold. The scissors on the floor were colder. The sharp sound of the metal hitting the old wooden planks echoed like a final judgment. The blackness held for a moment, a silent, empty space where a life's purpose used to be. The only sound was the rain, a soft, steady drumming against the window pane, like the world was weeping for me, or perhaps at me. I finally bent down, my joints protesting, and picked up the scissors. The metal was cold and heavy in my hand, lifeless. I placed them on the table and sank into my chair, my body feeling like a stranger's. My hand, the one that fell limp just moments ago, found its way to the old photo album on the shelf. My fingers, calloused and pricked from a lifetime of pushing needles through thick denim and delicate silk, traced the faded gold lettering on the worn leather cover. Our family. What a cruel joke that word had become. I opened it. The pages creaked, releasing the scent of dust and old paper, the smell of a life I thought I had built on a solid foundation. My hand hovered, then stopped on a picture from 20 years ago. Ethan, 10 years old, with a gap-toothed grin so wide it could have lit up the whole school gymnasium. He was holding a blue first-place ribbon for his science fair project, a ridiculous, wonderful volcano made of papier-mâché and baking soda that erupted all over our kitchen table. I stood beside him, my smile weary. I'd worked a double shift cleaning offices the night before just to pay for all the supplies. But my eyes were shining with a pride so fierce it almost hurt to look at. He was my brilliant boy, my sun and my moon, my entire world contained in one messy, joyful grin. The man who called me yesterday, his voice laced with the polite cruelty of a stranger, was not that boy. That boy would have wrapped his arms around my waist. He would have told me I was beautiful even with threads caught in my hair and flour on my cheek. He wouldn't have cared about perfect wedding pictures. He only would have cared that I was in them. That proud, loving little boy had been buried somewhere deep inside a man who now measured my worth in megapixels and aesthetics. What happens to a person to make them forget who loved them first? I turned the page. My breath caught in my throat. A photo from Ethan's college graduation. He stood tall in his cap and gown, holding his diploma like a key to a kingdom I had sold my soul to build for him, a kingdom where I was no longer welcome. I remember that day so clearly. He was so excited talking about job offers in the big city, about the bright, shiny future waiting for him. I just nodded and smiled, the secret of what that diploma truly cost burning a hole in my pocket. The acceptance letter had been a miracle. The bill for student activity and resource fees that came a week later was a death sentence. It was only a few $1,000s, but to me, it might as well have been $1 million. I had already sold my mother's jewelry. There was nothing left to borrow, nothing left to sell, except for one thing, the last piece of my past, the one thing I swore I would never part with. I remember standing at the counter of a grimy downtown pawn shop. The rain was streaking down the window, blurring the world outside. The man behind the glass had tired, indifferent eyes. He didn't look at my face. He only looked at the simple gold wedding band I slid across the counter. He weighed it. He grunted. He named a price that was an insult to the 30 years of love it represented. I didn't bargain. I didn't cry. A strange calm washed over me, the kind of calm you feel when you have no other choice left to make. I signed the paper. I took the cash. I walked out. My hand felt cold and naked for a year after that, but my son had his textbooks. He had his meal plan. He had his future. I stitched his future. He ripped up my past. I closed the album. The sound was soft, final. My steps were slow as I walked to the old wooden box I kept tucked away under my bed, the box he always thought was filled with nothing but junk. I lifted the lid. Inside, on a small velvet tray above everything else, was my husband's watch. It wasn't fancy. A simple leather strap, frayed at the edges. The steel casing was covered in tiny scratches, a map of a life well lived. He gave it to me the day before he went into the hospital for the last time. "It's not worth much, Kathy," he'd said, his voice a whisper, but it kept good time. Our time. I picked it up. The leather was cool against my skin. The watch was silent. Its hands were frozen at 3:15, the exact time his heart had stopped beating all those years ago. For my son, an object was only worth what he could sell it for. He never understood that some things are priceless, and some things you don't realize the value of until they're gone forever. The rain had started again, a soft, steady drumming against the window pane. I sat at my sewing table, my husband's old watch held loosely in my palm. The cool, silent metal was a small, solid anchor in a world that had suddenly turned to water. For a long time, I didn't move. I just sat there, listening to the rain. Each drop that hit the old tin roof of my porch sounded like a small, sad punctuation mark at the end of a long sentence. The sentence of my life as a mother, a life that, it seemed, was now over. The pride, the sacrifice, the boundless, unconditional love, all of it had been deemed an inconvenience, an embarrassment, something to be cropped out of the perfect picture. My son had built his beautiful new life on a foundation of my silent, tireless work, and now that the house was built, he wanted to tear the foundation down. A sharp, metallic clink thwump from the front door broke the silence. The mail slot had opened and closed. A thick white envelope lay on the dark, worn floorboards just inside the door. It looked pristine, alien, a stark white rectangle in my world of muted, faded colors. I didn't move at first. I just stared at it. Mail was usually just bills, catalogs for things I could never afford. But this felt different, heavier. Slowly, I placed my husband's watch back on the table, next to the photo album. My joints ached as I stood up. Each step to the door felt like I was wading through thick mud. I bent down, my knuckles brushing against the cold, damp floor as I picked up the envelope. It was heavy, the paper glossy and cool to the touch. It smelled of money and new beginnings. My name and address were printed on the front in a crisp, clean font. No return address. I carried it back to my table and sat down. My hands, which could guide the most delicate thread through the eye of a needle in near darkness, fumbled to open the seal. What fell out onto the table wasn't a letter. It was a collection of glossy, colorful brochures, fanning out like a cruel hand of playing cards. Sunset Manor, A Golden Life, Willow Creek Gardens, Dignity in Your Twilight Years, The Residence at Oak Lane, Luxury Senior Living. The pages were filled with pictures of smiling, silver-haired strangers. They were playing bingo. They were doing water aerobics in a sparkling blue pool. They were laughing together on a putting green, their clothes crisp and white. Everyone looked happy. Everyone looked healthy. Everyone looked managed, contained, put away. Their smiles were bright, but their eyes were vacant, Then a small yellow sticky note fluttered from the pages and landed on the table. 4 words written in my son's familiar, hurried script. "Looked into these for you." My breath caught in my chest. This was not a suggestion. This was a plan he had been making behind my back. The wedding wasn't just an event I was excluded from. It was the start of a new life where I no longer had a place at all. I wasn't just being uninvited. I was being disposed of. He wasn't just cutting me out of his wedding album. He was cutting me out of his life and boxing me up in a place with a cheerful, meaningless name. When the person you built your entire world for decides your world is too small for them, what is left? For 30 years, my purpose was clear: to protect him, to provide for him, to be his constant, unwavering North Star. Now, my purpose was to get out of his way, to fade into a pastel-colored room in a place called Sunset Manor and wait to die quietly without making a fuss, to become a neat, tidy problem that had been solved. I looked at the smiling woman on the cover of the brochure. She was knitting. Her hair was perfect. She didn't look like a burden. He sent me a brochure for my end. I found a book for his. The rain outside began to fall harder, the drumming on the roof growing louder, more insistent. The sadness in my chest, the hollow ache of despair, began to change. It curdled. It cooled. It hardened into something else entirely, something cold and heavy and strong. I did not cry. My time for tears was over. I stood up. I walked to the bed. I knelt down on the cold wooden floor. My hand reached into the darkness underneath, the dust bunnies tickling my arm. My fingers found the familiar rough grain of the old wooden box, the box he thought was filled with junk, the box that held my real story, my real worth. The sound of it scraping against the floor as I dragged it out was loud, rough, and final. The sound of the heavy wooden box scraping against the floor was loud, rough, and final. I dragged it into the center of my small, dimly lit sewing room and knelt before it. The rain outside had softened to a gentle drizzle, a quiet counterpoint to the storm that was now gathering inside me. For years, this box had been a silent keeper of my secrets, a time capsule of a life lived in the margins, a life I had carefully constructed in the shadows of my son's bright, demanding world. He saw it as a coffin for my past. He had no idea it was an incubator for my future. My hands, steady now, wiped a thick layer of dust from the lid. The small brass latch, stiff from disuse, clicked open with a sharp, definitive sound. It was the sound of a lock turning, a door opening. I lifted the lid. The first thing I saw was the velvet tray, my husband's watch resting in its center. I carefully lifted the tray out and set it aside, placing it gently on the floor beside me. And then I saw them, the folders, dozens of them, packed tightly together, faded manila folders, each labeled in my own neat, careful handwriting, a library of my silent labor. I pulled the first one out. The label read, Inheritance, Mother. Inside were yellowed bank slips from 40 years ago, a small sum my own mother had left me, a secret I had kept from everyone, even Ethan. I knew, even when he was a boy, that he had a talent for spending, for dreaming bigger than our budget. This money was never for his fleeting wants. It was the seed, the beginning of a promise I made to myself that I would never be a burden to anyone. I set the folder aside and pulled out another. Property, Elm Street Duplex. I remembered the day I bought it, right after Ethan left for college. Everyone said I was crazy buying in a neighborhood they called transitional, a polite word for poor. But I saw good bones. I saw a future. I used the last of my mother's money, and for 5 years I lived on almost nothing, pouring every spare dollar from my sewing into that building. It was my first anchor, my first taste of a security that was truly my own. Another folder. Commercial, Oak Street. A small brick storefront I bought from an elderly man whose children wanted nothing to do with it. I found reliable tenants, a nail salon, a tax preparer, a small sandwich shop. They paid their rent on time every month. Their small checks were the bricks I used to build my fortress, one by one. The pile of documents grew on the floor around me, stock certificates for boring, reliable index funds, deeds for 2 more small rental properties I'd acquired over the years. It was a paper trail of a hidden life, a story of a woman who was more than just a mother, a woman who was a provider, an investor, a quiet, methodical architect of her own survival. How is it that the people who live closest to you can see you the least? After an hour, the box was empty. The floor was covered in the architecture of my independence. I took out an old notepad and a small, cheap calculator from a drawer. My finger, the one that used to wear a wedding band, began to press the plastic buttons. The numbers on the small LCD screen climbed and climbed and climbed. My heart wasn't racing. My hands weren't shaking. This wasn't a lottery win. This was an audit, a final accounting of a life's worth of sacrifice and silence. I wrote down the final number on the notepad and stared at it. $2,987,452. He thought I was worthless. The bank thought I was worth almost $3 million. A strange feeling washed over me. It wasn't joy. It wasn't triumph. It was clarity. A cold, sharp, and terrifying clarity. All this time, I had been building a lifeboat, terrified of a storm I hoped would never come. But the storm was already here. My own son was the hurricane. And these papers, this number, this was my harbor. I looked over at the glossy nursing home brochures still sitting on my table. Their smiling, happy faces seemed to mock me. They were selling a quiet, managed end, a surrender. I would not be surrendering. I stood up. I closed the box. I walked to the telephone. My hand was perfectly still as I picked up the receiver and dialed the number from a small business card I had kept pinned to a corkboard for 5 years. The phone rang twice. A calm, professional voice answered on the other end, and my own voice, when I spoke, was unrecognizable even to me. It was calm. It was clear. And it was cold as ice as I told him my name was Catherine and that I needed to make some substantial changes to my will. The meeting with the lawyer, Mr. Franklin, was brief and cold. He was a man in his 60s, with kind eyes that had clearly seen every shade of human greed and disappointment. He reviewed my old will, the one that left my entire estate to my beloved son, Ethan. A wave of nausea washed over me as I saw the words. How naive I had been. How blind. I told Mr. Franklin everything. The phone call, the wedding, the nursing home brochures. I watched his kind eyes harden just slightly at the mention of the brochures. He had heard this story before. He knew this game. We spent 2 hours drafting the new documents. My hand did not shake as I signed my name, redirecting every penny of the life I had built to a foundation that helped single mothers stand on their own 2 feet. Women like me, women who deserved a fortress of their own. He may contest it, Mr. Franklin warned me, his voice gentle. He will claim you were not of sound mind. He will paint a picture of a lonely, confused old woman. I know, I said, my voice steady. I'm counting on it. A week passed. The new will was filed, a silent legal time bomb waiting for its moment. I spent the days in my shop mending clothes for my clients, the rhythmic hum of the sewing machine a comfort. I was not just mending fabric anymore. I was mending my own spine, stitching it together with threads of cold, hard resolve. I packed away my old life into boxes, preparing for a future he couldn't even imagine. Then, one rainy Tuesday afternoon, the phone rang. I looked at the caller ID, ETHAN. A strange calm settled over me. I let it ring twice more. On the third ring, I reached over and pressed the small, discreet record button on the new digital recorder I had bought for this exact purpose. Then I picked up the phone. My voice, when I answered, was soft, a little frail, the voice of the woman he expected me to be. Ethan, honey, it's so good to hear from you. His voice on the other end was like warm honey, sickeningly sweet. "Mom, how are you feeling?" "I've been so worried about you since we last spoke. I just want to make sure you're okay." The concern in his voice was a performance, and a bad one at that. I could almost hear his fiancée, Chloe, coaching him in the background. "I'm all right, dear. Just a little tired, that's all." I let my voice crack, just a little, a masterful stitch in the fabric of my deception. "See, that's what I'm worried about," he said, his tone shifting, becoming more serious. "That house is so big for you, Mom. The upkeep, the stairs. Chloe and I were talking, and we really think one of those residences would be so much better for you. You'd have friends your own age, proper care." I stayed silent. I let him fill the space with his own lies. "The thing is, Mom," he continued, getting to the real point of his call, "those places are expensive, really top-notch. And I was thinking, the best way to make sure you're set for life, without any financial worries, would be to sell the house." There it was, the final move in his cruel little game. He didn't just want me out of sight. He wanted to sell my home, my history, the very walls that held the echoes of my entire life, to pay for my own imprisonment. Did he really think I was that foolish? That broken? I let out a long, weary sigh, a sound I had practiced in my head a dozen times. "Oh, Ethan, I don't know. That house is all I have left of your father." "I know, Mom, I know," he said, his voice smooth and reassuring. "But Dad would want you to be safe and comfortable. This is what's best. It'll pay for everything. You won't have to worry about a thing. It was time to set the trap." I made my voice small, resigned, the voice of a woman giving up. "I suppose you're right, son. You always know what's best." I paused, then delivered the bait. "The house? And everything your father left me. It's all for you anyway. It was always meant for you." The silence on his end was for just a second, but in that second, I heard everything. I heard the surprise, the relief, the greed. He thought he had won. He thought the senile old woman had finally surrendered. "Exactly, Mom," he said, his voice now bright, triumphant. "That's the spirit. I knew you'd understand. Don't you worry about a thing. I'll have my lawyer get some papers drawn up." "That would be lovely, dear," I whispered. "Thank you for taking such good care of me." We said our goodbyes. He hung up, already dreaming of his inheritance. I pressed the stop button on the recorder. He called for my house. I recorded his downfall. I connected the device to my laptop. I saved the audio file to a secure folder. The computer asked for a file name. My fingers moved across the keyboard, typing out the name, letter by letter. Final. Evidence. The wedding was just 2 weeks away. My gift was ready. The day of the wedding arrived, bright and painfully beautiful. I chose a simple, elegant navy blue dress, the kind of dress that is respectable, but invisible, the kind of dress a ghost might wear. I sat in the very last pew of the enormous sun-drenched church, a silent observer at the funeral of the relationship I once cherished. The air smelled of white roses and money. Chloe was radiant in a dress that probably cost more than my first car. And Ethan, my son, stood at the altar, his face glowing with a pure, uncomplicated joy. The joy of a man who believed he had successfully edited all the inconvenient, ugly parts out of his life story. He looked perfect, he looked happy, and he looked like a complete stranger to me. I watched them say their vows, promising honesty and eternal respect. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. During the receiving line, I waited until the end. Chloe gave me a smile as brittle and perfect as spun glass. "Mrs. Patterson," she said, her voice a musical lie, "thank you so much for coming." Ethan just looked uncomfortable, a child caught doing something he knew was wrong. I handed them a small, wrapped gift, a silver picture frame, and as I leaned in to give my son a congratulatory hug, my hand, practiced from years of delicate stitching, slipped the lawyer's thin envelope into the inside pocket of his tuxedo, a final, secret stitch. He never felt a thing. The next morning, I was sitting in my quiet shop drinking a cup of tea when a car skidded to a halt on the street outside. A door slammed, heavy, frantic footsteps pounded up my walkway. My front door burst open, crashing against the wall, and there was Ethan. He was still wearing the tuxedo pants and wrinkled dress shirt from his wedding. His expensive haircut was a mess. His eyes were wild with panic and disbelief. He was holding the letter from Mr. Franklin's office, the paper trembling in his hand. His face was a mask of pale, horrified rage. "What did you do?" he screamed, his voice cracking. "What in God's name did you do?" I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea. I looked at him, this strange, frantic man who used to be my little boy. The love I once felt was gone. In its place was a vast, cold emptiness. "My money?" I finally said, my voice quiet, calm. "I gave it away." "Gave it away?" he sputtered, stepping towards me. "You can't do that. It's my inheritance. It's my future. You're insane. You're a vindictive old—" "I am of perfectly sound mind," I said, cutting him off. My voice was as sharp and clean as the snip of my sewing scissors. I have a doctor's certificate to prove it, and a video statement recorded at my lawyer's office. "But the house," he stammered, his mind scrambling. "You promised." "On the phone, you said everything Dad left you was for me. I have you on that. You promised." I looked at him. The boy who learned to manipulate before he learned to shave. The man who thought a promise was a loophole to be exploited. "Yes," I said. "I did say that." I reached into my pocket and took out my small phone. I pressed a button, and I played the recording of our last conversation. The sound of his own voice filled the small room, stripped of its fake concern, dripping with an ugly, undeniable greed as he talked about selling my home to pay for my care. He froze, his mouth hanging open. The color drained from his face, leaving a sickly, gray pallor. He was listening to the sound of his own damnation. My love was the inheritance. You threw it away. He stared at me, speechless, horrified not by his own cruelty, but by the fact that it had been caught, that it had a consequence. I stopped the recording. The silence returned, heavier than before. "You were right, Ethan," I said softly. "Your father did leave you something, and I kept my promise." I stood up, walked over to the old wooden box, and lifted the lid. I reached in and took out the old, scratched watch. I walked back to the table and placed it down between us. The sound of the metal against the wood was soft, but it echoed like a gunshot. He stared at the watch as if it were a snake. "This is what your father left you," I said, my voice cold and final. A reminder of his time. A reminder of a love that was real. I paused, letting him look at the worthless, priceless object that was now his only inheritance. I looked him dead in the eye. "As for my money, the money I earned, you are not worthy of it." He sank to his knees then, right there on the dusty floor of my little shop. The handsome, successful man disappeared, replaced by a sobbing, broken child. He begged, he pleaded, he promised to change, but his words were just noise, the desperate sounds of a man who had not lost his mother, but his fortune. I turned away from him. I walked to the window. I looked out at the rain. It was finally over. I didn't watch him cry for long. There was nothing left to see. The boy I loved was a ghost, and the man he'd become was a stranger sobbing over a bank account. I turned away from him, and from the window, I watched the rain begin to soften, as if the sky itself had finally wept all of its tears. I didn't say another word. I just left him there, kneeling on the floor of a life he had just burned to the ground. That was the last time I ever saw my son. The weeks that followed were a blur of quiet, methodical work. There were no more tears. There was no more anger. There was only a plan. Mr. Franklin, my lawyer, was efficient and discreet. We sold the house. We liquidated the properties one by one. The assets from my secret life were converted into clean, liquid numbers in a bank account that Ethan's name would never touch. I packed one suitcase with a few simple clothes, my photo album, and my husband's watch. Everything else, the furniture, the sewing machines, the physical remnants of Catherine the mother, I left behind. 1 week before my flight, Mr. Franklin made the final call. He informed Ethan that I had been diagnosed with a sudden, aggressive illness. He told him I had moved to a private, long-term care facility in another state. He explained that my final wish was to not be a burden and that I did not want any visitors. It was a kinder story than the one he deserved. It gave him a tragedy to tell his friends, a respectable reason for my absence. It allowed him to be the grieving son, a role I knew he would play with theatrical perfection. He never questioned it. He never tried to find me. My disappearance was a gift, a final convenient solution to the problem of his ugly, inconvenient mother. A few months later, as instructed, Mr. Franklin informed him of my passing. He arranged a small, simple memorial service. He sent me a single photograph from that day. In the picture, a handful of people sat in a sterile, beige room, and there, in the front row, was Ethan. He was staring at a framed picture of me, the one from my wedding day, his face a mask of what a stranger might mistake for grief. He was looking at a photograph of my past. From the terrace of my small apartment, I was looking at my future. The air here, on the coast of the Mediterranean, smells of salt and jasmine. It's warm, even in the mornings. I wake up with the sun now, not with the weight of another person's needs on my shoulders. I drink coffee that is strong and black. I read books I never had time to open. I am learning to speak a new language, and the words feel strange and wonderful in my mouth. The words of a woman I am only just beginning to know. I walk along the beach in the afternoons. I watch the waves wash away the footprints in the sand. Every day the shore is wiped clean, a fresh start, a new beginning. I thought for so long that my identity was stitched together from the roles I played for others: wife, seamstress, mother. When my son cut those threads, I thought I would unravel into nothing, but I was wrong. Beneath all those layers was simply me. A woman I had not spoken to in over 30 years, a woman who was stronger, smarter, and more resilient than I ever gave her credit for. The mother he knew, the one who lived only for him, she really did die in that cold, final phone call. I mourned her, briefly. Then I let her go. This morning, I woke before the dawn. I made a cup of tea and sat on my terrace, wrapped in a soft blanket. I watched the sky begin to bleed with the soft colors of a new day, orange and pink, and a brilliant, hopeful gold. I looked down into the dark, still surface of my tea, and for the first time in my 62 years, I truly saw the woman in the reflection. Her hair was white. Her face was lined with the map of her past, but her eyes were clear, and she was smiling. Sometimes you have to bury a life to start living. Thank you so much for holding space for this story with me. Family is complicated, and if this brought up anything for you, I would be honored to read about your own experiences in the comments, and I hope you'll subscribe to share more moments like this with us.